Hey everyone, let's talk about one of the most popular questions that especially atheists like to put to Christians, to theists. If God exists, why is there suffering and or evil in the world? I'll continue with this question. Why does he allow tragedies? How does one rationalize that? If free will exists, explains human disasters, what explains natural disasters? All right. So, yeah, the idea, obviously, God is omniscient and omnipotent, and since suffering and evil is bad, that's our first logical error. Since suffering and evil is bad, God is good, and good cannot allow bad. That's another logical error. Then, kind of giving you a preview into where this argument is already breaking down. And how could God allow suffering and or evil? All right. So I guess the very first thing that we can do to address this idea of suffering and evil is to break that down into its components. Okay, suffering can happen as a result of evil, but it can also happen as a result of random events, mistakes. Okay, so there's evil that's explicitly malicious, and then there's mistakes, which may advance evil, but may be not malicious. Okay. So, but anyhow, what is goodness, and can goodness allow suffering and evil? And the answer is that suffering and evil can exist and can be allowed, especially if it advances goodness. Okay. So, if you think about two paths, one path, you expend a set number of resources. We're going to put in maybe dollars. One path takes $1,000, and you can eliminate, let's just say, 100% of evil. And another path, you can spend $10 and eliminate, let's say, 90% of evil. And in both cases, you can use, well, in the latter case, let's say, with those $10, you can make sure that the 10% of evil actually advances good by 20%. Okay. That kind of an example would illustrate that if it's possible to use fewer resources to advance good and use the bad to your advantage, then you're ahead. There are fighting techniques based on this method, this approach, that use the opponent's energy to go against them. And so, for instance, if an opponent, say, put a lot of energy towards you, perhaps in stepping forward and launching a punch, you would simply step slightly out of the way, so you expend a little bit of energy. You would grab their hand, right, and then pull them through. So they already have momentum going towards you, and now you pull them through so that they are now behind you, and you pivot so that now you are behind them. Okay, so you're using their energy against them and putting yourself in a more advantageous position. That is, you're behind them and they're still moving forward. For them to then attack you again, they would have to turn around and put effort to stop themselves from going away from you, and then put more effort to go towards you again. So this is kind of an example of an efficient fighting style where you use your opponent, say evil, against itself. Okay, so that would be the wiser course of action. Now, you might think, well, why would you care about conserving your own effort, your own resources, if you're omnipotent, if you have all power? And the answer to that would be that omnipotence can be achieved by, in the first case, we can't assume that the resources that are available to God are infinite, okay? Because while the universe may go on infinitely. The amount of resources that are available in one particular area are limited. It's the same thing on Earth. You go to build stuff, you have to mine resources, and the amount of resources available in an area are limited. Okay, so then the amount of energy is limited as well. The sun only produces a certain amount of energy in a given period of time. It's limited. It's not infinite energy from the sun. Okay, so in all things reality, there's a limited number of resources that are available. And if you take some of those resources that are directed against you and you use it against your opponents in a way that makes them have to use more energy to accomplish their objectives, you can actually win a war, and America did this with Russia. You can win a war by making your opponent spend more than they have. And so that's what we did with Russia. We made them spend more than they had. They spent themselves bankrupt. Now, I'm not saying we did an efficient way to do that, and because we spent a lot too. It's just we had a lot more to spend. America did. But it was an example where if you can make your opponent use a lot more resources to accomplish their objectives, then you can, at the very least, you can divert resources that they have available for other things. So they may have wanted to use their extra resources for other battles, for other conflicts in other places, and they might have had to divert resources away from those areas to the place where you force them to use extra resources. So I hope we're getting at the idea pretty effectively that when you try to do something, you have to use resources. You have to use energy, you have to use time, concentration, thought, people. One thing that people don't realize is that God acts through us. A lot of people realize it, but they don't realize how important that is. God uses angels to do things. So by using these resources, he has to make sure that they're being used as best they can be, as most effective. So why is there suffering and evil? Well, it turns out that suffering and evil can serve a good purpose. For instance, if you have let's say a stove and it's hot, okay? Well, let's just go with a hot pan, okay? We're not going to imagine worst case scenarios. A very hot pan, and let's say you touch it, okay? There's going to be harm and suffering. You're not going to die, but you will suffer, okay? Now, we're just ignoring the evil part for a second, okay? Why evil is allowed, but why suffering is allowed. Once you feel that pain, you learn something instinctively, intuitively. You learn that touching that pan was a bad idea. And if it happened that maybe your father told you to not touch that pan because it was hot, and then you touch the pan, you learn to respect the father's word. When he warns you the next time that something is hot, you'll listen to him more. So suffering is a learning tool. Pain is a learning tool. Damage and harm is a learning tool. Now, it's not to say that God is doing this. He's not causing us suffering directly. It's just to say that when suffering happens, it can be a way of reinforcing what God says. It can be a way of teaching us God's ways. Okay. For the evil component, why could evil be allowed? Well, let's say that it doesn't even have to be a brother. A friend comes over and says, after your father says, "Don't touch it, it's hot," he says, "Oh, it's fine. It's not that hot. You'll be fine. You can touch it." Okay? So that might be the voice of evil. Someone, especially if he knows that it'll hurt you, why would the father allow you to touch it still? Okay, in the first place, he might know that it's not so hot that you have to go to the emergency room or that it'll permanently affect your life, okay? And then you might know that, well, you'll learn to not trust evil, right? Or not trust other people, but trust him more. And so, yeah, you touch it, then you learn that evil is wrong. So that's the case with all evil. And when someone promotes sin, and they say, there's no harm in having sex before marriage. Okay. They're promoting the sin. You engage in it, and then you suffer. And you might not know why you're suffering. You might not know the lessons learned. You might not even know that is a direct result of the sin. And it might take you a long time to figure that out. Okay. Or you might have some good mentors and they can help you understand the dynamics of what's going on with the dishonor and help you understand how that plays into the anger and resentment and destruction in the relationships. Okay, so evil can create suffering, and yet it can still be, I wouldn't necessarily say it's good, but it can be used for good. People can take lessons learned. They can remember, these guys are promoting sin, right? And it always brings suffering when I listen to these guys. When I hang out with the druggy friends, it's always a bad influence. I don't want to hang out with the druggy friends anymore. They can do their drugs, and I'm going to go on a better path. Okay. Problem with that is that by the time it takes us to learn those lessons, we can end up suffering immensely, even permanently. Okay, some of these things that people are doing with the transgender movement and genital mutilation and chemical castrations and all that, they are permanent. That you cannot reverse that kind of damage. And so, yeah, they may end up learning lessons 20, 30 years down the road and regretting it and suing the guys that did that, but nothing's going to bring back, undo the damages that were done. And that's one of the reasons why it's important for us to warn, to stand as a voice of warning for those who would go that way, not necessarily in a contemptuous way or in a harsh way, but in an enlightening way, where we say, okay, follow these paths and you'll see these things, right? You'll see goodness and honor and strength, and follow these other paths and you're going to see the other things, and help them to see before they get into it, help them to see the problems. All right, so I hope we covered why there's suffering and evil in the world. God does advance goodness. He does put efforts into that, but he realizes that it's more efficient in many cases to allow us to have our agency and to make our decisions, and to not really try to fight us too much on it, not really try to manipulate us too much, but to let us see the consequences, to let us hurt ourselves and others. Okay, so I think I covered that really well. Why does God allow tragedies? Okay, so we've mostly talked about the suffering and the evil by our decisions, but now talking about tragedies and human disasters versus natural disasters. Okay, we know a couple of things from the beginning of the world. The partaking of the fruit of the tree brought death. It brought disease, suffering, work. We know that a lot of things became corrupted at that time. We don't know why. We can speculate. We can have some pretty good ideas on how that came to be. We got viruses and bacteria that could destroy us and stuff like that. But whatever the case is, this corruption in the world, you might call it natural disasters in a way, because what's a plague but a natural disaster in a way, or volcanoes and things like that. So we know from the beginning of time there have always been natural disasters, but many of them began with Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Many of them began as a result of our sin. But either way, that is the state of the world. We have to fight for our lives. You get some disease, you're going to have to take some medicine. So how do we explain natural disaster? Heat builds up below the earth, its core, heats up magma, creates pressure in the volcano, and then something gives way and explodes and magma comes out, right? Then we have a a volcanic eruption. Okay, how do we explain natural disasters? Physics works. Okay, physics has always worked. Natural processes have always happened. And we don't necessarily even have to attribute that God made the magma get hot and God made, now it's not to say that God didn't necessarily have any effects in that, maybe in causing a certain part or making sure that a certain part would, give way at a certain time and then serve to reinforce the lesson that we had learned, maybe Sodom and Gomorrah and people were super sinful, and then God has certain things queued up, political things and so forth, that maybe he kind of tilted or influenced in a way that kind of happened at certain times in certain places. But it's not to necessarily say that they wouldn't have happened without God's intervention. He might just, manipulate the timing. He might manipulate exactly how or when or where some of these things happen, just to kind of nudge us along, right, and help us to see things a little bit better, and realize, hey, maybe we need to turn to God. Maybe we need to rethink things a little bit. But physics happens, and no one should say for sure that God necessarily had a role in any natural disaster, unless, of course, they had scientific proof to back them up, right? Was the Noah's flood going to? I'm not saying Noah caused the flood, but the flood at Noah's time, was that done by God? Or was it just a natural disaster that happened to happen about that time, and God used that as a teaching tool? So God does love to use teaching tools. He loves to teach us, help us to learn and get away from our sins and figure out a better path. And he'll use any method that we're open to listening. If we have to see lessons in natural disasters, he'll try to help us to see those lessons in that way. If we learn better from simply humbling ourselves voluntarily and asking for visions and asking for his guidance, that's probably his preferred way to do it, right? Less effort, just teach us directly and we listen. But oftentimes we don't listen. We're not ready to listen. We don't want to listen. And so God's all wise. He's already seen everything in advance, to the end of time. So he knows, at some points we're not going to listen to him in any way. We're just too dedicated to our sins and destroying ourselves. So, why is there suffering or evil in the world? I would say, yeah, twofold. We bring it on ourselves, and physics happens. Stuff happens, and sometimes we get in the way. The volcano didn't necessarily erupt because humans were around it necessarily. It may have just been that humans happened to be around it. We were in the wrong place, the wrong time. And what is God supposed to create a magical force field to protect everybody in the city next to the volcano? He would do that if it's part of his plan, but why would that have to be part of his plan? We would have to assume that sparing people suffering, sparing people dying, is an incredibly important part of God's plan. And he's made it very, very obvious that this time on earth is just a very short period of time in a very long plan, an eternal plan. He's got bigger fish to fry. He's got bigger things going on. And yeah, suffering is awful. But when you compare it to evil on the scale that God sees, when you compare it to the things that God needs to have happen, the goodness that he needs to make happen, evil isn't that big a deal. And evil, if we're willing to use it as a teaching tool, we can learn from evil that evil is bad. And we can learn from evil on how to effectively fight evil. We can learn to be more effective instruments in God's hands. We can craft more effective weapons to fight for God, to fight for goodness. And if we learn that, then, it served its purpose. So hope that answers that pretty well. Death is not the end. It's not completely tragic. There is a resurrection after this life. There's an eternity after this life for us to learn and progress and come closer to Him and, push His good work forward. So, yeah, I think maybe considering suffering in this life as being, terrible is probably arrogance on our part to think that, our lives right now are so important in the grand scheme of things. Our lives serve a purpose. There's an importance to what we do in this world. There's an importance to the lessons that we learn that we take with us to the next life. But suffering in itself is no. I mean, if it breaks you, then you're not holding on to God. You don't have His strength. And if it doesn't break you, it just makes you stronger. Or through God, you can become stronger. So I guess that's the big thing that people don't realize when they are so afraid of suffering and evil, is that there are much bigger things going on, and through God we can overcome it all, and we can achieve much bigger things than just a few days where we've got a second-degree burn on our hands. Put some ice on it, get some burn medicine, let it heal, learn your lesson, move on. All right, thanks for watching. I hope that really helps. This is really, really intense and tough question for a lot of people, and I hope that really helps to bring peace to your lives and knowing that you can be happy through suffering. You can be good through evil. While evil is combining against you, the power of God is incredible. With sufficient faith, you can accomplish all things in Him. And I certainly know that to be true. All right, thanks for watching. Talk to you guys later.